any group. So negative stereotypes about women, for example, that they're intuitive, emotional, and they had that awful term in the 20s and so on, still used now, but for slightly different reasons. But the term hysteria, which was literally like womb craziness. So by virtue of having ovaries and a womb, women were seen as having their thoughts interfered with in some different way from men. And so again, this is as a sociologist, you see the trend here of the marking of difference to kind of explain it away and say, oh, well, Britain or Canada or America or whatever country we're talking about, this crime problem that we're having or these emotional family problems, they're not really our issues. They're this one group's issue. So again, think of yourself in that Harvey's and your sales are going down or customers are complaining a lot. It might be easier to do what's called scapegoating, blaming it on one group of employees, one group of customers, than to actually find a solution to the root problem. So again, the theoretical aspect of this is more thinking, given that you probably like to think that most people are good people, why have such awful things happen in human history? And oftentimes they're indirect offshoots of these bad ways of solving problems. And again, that's not to say there aren't horrible people, horrible racist leaders out there like Hitler and so on. But a lot of the ways these generate, looking as a sociologist, is much more indirect and more about these kind of tendencies to exclude, which then become these horrible systems. I think our mics arrived. So. Oh, thanks so much. Oh, it's really. It's good, because I was all rough. I was just getting prepared. So now we'll see all my rambling and chaos. Except for those of you that are here, so that's why you should come. I'm more candid when there's no camera too, so now I'm going to be all wooden. Okay. So welcome to all my web options students. This is new interactive. So you missed the first half hour or so, but we're picking up where we left off on race and ethnicity. I talked about the discovery. This term we're going to be more empirically focused. Race builds off of gender and sexualities. Theoretically, the way we're approaching it. And if you want to know the other tidbits, you have to ask your lifelong study buddy, and they should be in this room. You guys should have like a blood pact where if one of you isn't here, the other is. So, okay. All right. So now again, and again, I'll clarify part of my point of being here as a professor again differently. The textbook. Many of you have talked to me. There's a ton of definitions. But I was really happy when I looked at the test one and that little feedback thing I gave you, the question at the end. It seems the overwhelming majority of you, because I read over all of them over the break, the overwhelming majority of you really like Revel, and it gets you to read in a focused way. So this term, especially now that I know that, and I know you're really staying on top of the readings, I'm seeing more and more of you are doing them kind of earlier and scoring better on the quizzes, so that's great. So in lecture, as promised, I'm going to try to make it more interactive and really push your thinking into a more conceptual level. Because now you're no longer Intro 1 students. This was the classic sociology class. You're now Intro 2, which I taught. So I've never taught Intro 1. So you had a rough cut or whatever of that. But I did teach Intro 2 before. So I'm more experienced with this level of student than I was with last term. So hopefully that will be positive experience and not a detriment. Okay, so social construction is tied to this. So the myth of race, again, there's all sorts of myths. Myths of gender, myths of ability, which we'll see with health, myths of crime, and these are constructed by social groups to kind of explain away problems or to scapegoat them onto someone or to exclude a group. Again, sometimes, like in the case of Nazi Germany, for an awful, just completely racist view of people, and other times more indirectly. So policies which disfavor groups for different reasons, or bureaucratic laws that get passed that are actually quite racist, but people at the time didn't know that they were. We'll get to some examples later. So this connects to the broader theme that we've discussed throughout the course, and really sociologists' entry into these sorts of questions. Because you might be saying, well, race and ethnicity, well, we've only talked really about race so far, but if race is this construction of difference, and it's about physical features and skin tone and all of that, what can sociologists really say about that? We're not biologists, or we don't study human features in that way. Well, the observation that race is constructed by groups, that categories change over time, and that the emergence, this is the key point for me really, that the emergence of racial categories usually occurs around some sort of panic. So like a crime spike or an immigration spike, or think of right now in the American context, a lot of racism going on, and that's around economic recessions, job loss, the loss of automotive blue-collar jobs, and members of the white majority feeling disenfranchised by they're not sure who, but they're just trying to think of targets. Again, some out of hate, some out of genuine confusion and wanting a job, but they're trying to find sources of their problems, of their personal problems. And that often leads people to think and to construct or to strengthen or even change their categories of people. So here again, seeing race as part of this history of colonialism, that also explains why in times of recession, people that see themselves as natives of the country, born there or second generation, 1.5 generation or whatever, they may be more likely to say, immigration is the sense of, is responsible for my problems. Outsiders are the ones that are causing issues. Again, trying to find a source of the pain and strengthening this socially constructed category. Again, to link it to gender, when women got the right to vote and then women started entering the workplace more, you can bet there was a lot of backlash from men saying women are taking all the jobs. Now, when women could have a say in divorce rates, now women are disrupting the family. So again, when something's changing, trying to explain it by blaming someone else. Kind of a human tendency that goes wrong. Okay. So building right on that. So now this is a key important point. So again, something that could get lost just from reading a textbook. And I want to have us discuss this. So sociologists, it's very, very important. By saying that race is socially constructed, we are not saying that race is not real. There are a lot of things that are socially constructed, things that are just made up, basically. I could make up a whole discipline, and it could be total nonsense. I could just teach you things that are all wrong, but I could be evaluating you on that and treating it as though it's real. And I could, let's say I was mega rich, and I could set up jobs where you needed to take Lawrence studies and take L101, L102, L404, and it's all nonsense, and I'm laughing and just eating popcorn in the back. But you need those credentials. And so they're real. Lawrence studies would be real as a social category. And if you had a PhD in Lawrencium, which is also an element, PhD in Lawrencium, that would be real. And I could stigmatize you if you don't have it. Say, oh, look at that guy. He has chemistry but not Lawrencium. What a dud. And so it becomes real. So that's a lighthearted example. Unless it became real, because then I'd be really a tyrant about it. But that's a funny example. But race is like that as well, too. So again, the general story, a majority population casts certain physical or social markers, race, gender, ability, and they treat those as real. And then if you're in a society where you feel less than for one of those reasons, then that is real. And as a sociologist, we want to study that. So again, I think that clarifies some of the issues of what it is sociologists do. We study categories and phenomena that impact people's lives, or that they think impact their lives. Anything. So that's why, you know, I studied video games, death and dying laws as they changed. I like studying things that people are really confused about. So race, again, is more clear than that. Usually, people can, including my interviewees, can give you very concrete examples of how they experienced racism, how they experienced xenophobia, and that gives sociologists a lot to work with. So again, we're not debating here. Just because we're saying race is not genetic and it's social, doesn't mean it's not real. Because if you're living in a society where people have been stratified, putting that cake on different levels, then that cake is going to impact who eats you, or whatever. Okay, so this process, so the process of this, of socially sorting people based on their race, is called the process of racialization. And so this is, you know, it says it's a process of many complex features, all becoming kind of congealed into easy categories. So you'll see this in things like the census and, you know, most sorts of surveys you've filled out in your lives so far, I'm sure, where they ask for, depending on the survey, your race or ethnicity, or what race you identify with or ethnicity you identify with. They often word it differently. But you'll see here things like black, sometimes European, Caucasian, white, Asian, Chinese. It depends. Sometimes they dissect it or lump it more depending on who makes it. But racialization, so it's the process by which different, you know, humans as a group become sorted into humans of different races. And racialization going further, so if you're thinking of your topics, you can think how certain occupations become racially segregated. So what's an example of an occupation you can think of, and again, don't be afraid in this classroom, it's not stereotypical because I'm asking you a question based on statistics, so try to think of one that you just think based on statistics, not about motivations or anything. But what's an occupation in Canada that you think might be racially segregated? Yep. Nursing. Okay. So what race do you think is predominantly in nursing?
Sorry, I realized the question was gender.
No, yeah, gender's nursing. Yeah. So that's when I was like, which one? I mean, yeah. Okay. Any other example? Yep.
There's mostly white men in the corporate world, like within business.
Yes, so corporate world, mostly white men. If you take that up to the highest level, so C-suite jobs, executive jobs, it's predominantly white. And it's also predominantly tall, too. So I think I'm in the wrong profession. No, I'm not actually. When we get to ethnicity, I'm actually half Caribbean. But so we'll get to that, too. But race trumps ethnicity, so I'm going to be that CEO. No, I don't know. I'm saying awful things. You take what you can in life. So racialization. So that's a great example of white males predominantly having leadership roles. Again, think of it in the context of the country. British colonizers coming to Canada, many of the norms set up kind of taught you to implicitly see white men as leaders and over and above other individuals. Not saying people internalize that all the time, but that's one of the kind of dominant narratives that we operate with in the society. Yep.
A lot of racialized women are they're centered in the domestic labor service.
Yep. Yes, so that's the example I was thinking of. So racialized women, Filipina women are quite common as nannies and domestic workers. Also as tied in with domestic workers are personal support workers. So there are actually many kind of government-sponsored programs that will pay families to take on some of the immigration costs of women that are trained as these care workers in the Philippines and send them to Canada. And they have that also. One of a professor I worked with, she studied Filipina care workers that worked in South Korea. They have those programs too. And it's not just that, programs were randomly made to kind of brain drain nursing out of those countries and into those other countries. But those care jobs are not paid very well, and majority white women and men, or South Korean women and men in those countries, don't want to take them, and so they become quote-unquote immigrant jobs. And they're seen as not prestigious and underpaid and all of those things. So this process of racialization, because of the real impacts that it has, so again, and I'm candid, it's something I can't speak to as well as even though I'll get to it in ethnicity, I'm ethnically Caribbean in terms of the race side. Race, it's like the looking glass self. Remember, there's the self that you know, and then there's the self that other people see and people give off. So when people talk to me, I most of the time, they'll either explicitly say it, or I just sense that they think I'm white, which I mostly do identify as, even though I'm white Caribbean. Race and ethnicity get all complicated as we'll get to. But I'm not going to pretend that I've experienced racism when I haven't, is the point that I'm trying to make. So internalized racism is this very linked to the, see, I need to refresh myself from first term too, from 101. From Du Bois, from his concept, what am I can't believe this. What kind of professor am I that I don't even remember the things I'm teaching you. Help me out. Double consciousness, yes, okay. So whether that was real or fake, I don't know, to generate questions. So Du Bois' double consciousness is very linked, as well as the looking glass self, taking on the perceptions of others, and building your own self-identity through that. So, if people had constantly told me, which no one did, obviously, you're Caribbean, get out of Toronto or whatever. If people had said that to me, I'd say, what? No, like, fine, screw you, I'm going back to San Fernando. But where my dad's from. But that didn't happen to me, so I don't have, a whole bunch of internalized racism. However, people in my neighborhood in North York, the stories they would tell me of going to a store and being profiled as a black person, or being told, a friend of mine in pharmacy school, where someone thought she was a maid, and these sorts of things that happen more often than you'd think as a kind of white majority person. These things deeply impact people's self-concepts. So again, that's part of how, even though we could say race is bogus, we're all the same, and it's socially constructed and rooted in power, the fact that this process becomes internalized from a kind of social psychological perspective makes it real and makes studying it important and also very interesting. So let's do one last thing before we break and then get on to ethnicity. Or we'll do ethnicity, then a break. So in saying that race is real as a category, we do, as sociologists and social scientists more generally, we do advocate a switch in terminology to get rid of a lot of that kind of genetic, individual level baggage and really just racist stuff that's associated with the concept. So sociologists more generally argue that, and we have moved away throughout the 21st century in particular in most surveys and public documents. But we argue moving away from the term race and towards either minority groups or racialized, I think this one's even better, racialized populations. So calling a group a racialized population basically answers that sort of question that I had about my own identity. Clearly I was never racialized from my own subjective perspective, growing up in North York. I never felt unfairly treated. I didn't feel marginalized or stigmatized. People never told me to go back home or whatever. So I was not a part of a racialized population. So the Caribbean half of me was invisible predominantly, and so I was part of the majority group. Whereas if I was someone that was experiencing, being asked where I'm from, having insults hurled at me, then I would be part of a racialized population, because that process would be happening. I think this also helps explain society to society, because you could see, a group that's a minority in one country could be a majority somewhere else. And so there, that process of racialization may not be going on. If you're in a society that's 99% one racial category, then this process of sorting people in this way, it still will happen. I know anecdotally, just from some of my friends, people do, not even anecdotally, statistically, skin lightening creams and things like that in other countries do exist, that are still grounded in kind of Western imperialism of, those images of white people being superior still go around the world. But again, a group that could be marginalized strongly in one country may not be in another. So all of this, I think, connects nicely to the second half of race, which is ethnicity. So we'll talk briefly about this before moving on. So race is, if you're going to take the kind of genetic explanation, it's really, skin tone. So it is whether you're, if most people in a survey would think of you as being, say, black or white or brown or whatever color, but your ethnicity, and so that's pretty much fixed in your life, with the exception of skin bleaching and things like that. But that's pretty well fixed. But your ethnicity is the thing that can change over time. So the ethnicity is the much more active component, the kind of component where there's a lot more agency than the racial category. So what does that mean? So this builds really nicely off the stuff we read on culture, and also helps explain kind of my situation. So ethnicity, it's one's status, ancestry, language, and often religious affiliation. So that's just a list of some things it can be. But really what I like to think of as ethnicity is, what your ethnicity is tied to the group that you feel some sort of kin-like or ethnic affiliation with. It could be national, it could be city level, it could be religious. So here it says people who, an ethnic group, which I think is the easier of the two to understand. This is people who identify with each other based on a common culture, art forms, language, music, traditions, and beliefs. Now, very important, ethnicity is still tied to race. Because you may think, when you see something like ethnic group, that almost sounds like any sort of subculture, right? Like you could think of gamers, and they share music, like their weird electronic gaming music, traditions and beliefs, playing video games, the value of poning noobs, all these things, culture of ponage, art forms, manga, whatever. And so they have all of those things, but they don't have a common race. So ethnicity is still tied to race. It's kind of seen as a subcategory of it. You have race, and then you have ethnicity, which is that. So Caribbean, for example, part of why, and I heard it with the class too when I said I'm half Caribbean, I always usually get some sort of not confused, some unexpected response, or a response of, oh, that's cool, because Trinidad is vast majority black and East Indian. Trini is basically when I think of people asking me, because it's a small little fun island, it's a population smaller than Toronto still, I think, but it's primarily black and East Indian mixes. So when I think of my friends in Trinidad, it's these awesome people that like to talk in fun, sing-songy ways and eat roti and doubles, and which I love. So, although now I'm low carb, so I'm sad when I see doubles. I can eat the inside sort of, but I'll have them when I'm there again. I was supposed to go this Christmas. I usually go every Christmas. My grandmother just turned 95 in May, so I went. I saw her twice this year, so I thought I need to stay here and be dedicated on explaining Trinidad over the Christmas break rather than going there. But in my example again, the ethnic group that you can relate to, I've been there about 10 times in my life, and my cousins and many of my best friends live there, and that was always, liking ethnic cuisine, coming out of Trinidadian food. I tend to like, spicy, meaty foods and things that I would eat there, and they're nice baked breakfast foods, and like, music at Carnival, and all those things. So part of me has always identified with that ethnicity and that culture, but another part of me, being perceived as a white person in Toronto, also identify ethnically as white. So I'm bi-ethnic. You could think of yourself that way also. So it's another thing to add to my repertoire, gay, bi-ethnic, whatever. So anyway, so not to make a joke of things. Okay, so again, this is all just to think of yourself. And it's I love it, as I said in my dissertation, I gave people life history interviews. So just as a note, I did get approval for our interview assignment. So that's assignment number 3. So you will be interviewing 2 people. So I will try to talk more about interviews because that's what I do. I do really long but fun interviews with people, like 3-hour-long ones. But you don't have to do that. You just have to do 20 minutes. But if you're like me, you'll just want to keep gabbing and probing, and you want to know everything about a person all the way down to their birth weight. No, not that far, but, maybe. About race and ethnicity, again, when you ask people these things, what do you identify as, you get into these sorts of really interesting, complex stories. And many people are confused when they come down to it. I think that's part of the fascination right now. I just heard some students talk about it in the hallway, of things like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. We're always very interested just to see where we came from. And I don't think most people are thinking about it on a genetic level, but more of thinking, where were my ancestors in the past? What kind of traditions, could be part of me that I don't know? So that's, again, there's a lot of inequality and important things you can study around race and ethnicity, around difference. But I think the connection to culture is also quite good too. Sociology sometimes, the material we read can be quite sobering and upsetting, and it's for our own well-being and self-help. I often study very traumatic things, so I do like to find, again, things that show people's agency and kind of things they can take out of life and find meaning in all of that, aside from also just the inequality aspects. I think it's always good to balance both. Because you see, if you point out inequality, then you also have to point out, well, how can we improve things? And what good can we take from things? Okay, so before the break, so just a question. I want, if you don't have your lifelong study buddy here, that's okay. You should make a new one. So why do you think people might continue to use the term race when describing individuals or groups? So we've talked about this maybe jargony sounding idea of racialized population, but we've also talked about ethnicity. And some of you may use that word. Just show of hands before we do it. Who uses the term race and there's no right or wrong, obviously, for this. Who uses the term race when they're talking about their own identity? Show of hands. Who uses the term ethnicity? So a lot of you are termless, so that's great. Okay, so no, you're confused, but that's good. So okay, so if you're, how many of you aren't sure what you would use? Okay, so that's about everyone. So I think it's interesting, it's split. I mean, there has been, it's good, but that speaks to the textbook's point, that there has been a move away from race. And I think, again, it's more, surveys use alternating terms, so that's probably part of it. But okay, So just your question, get in your pairs and for a couple minutes discuss why do you think people continue to use the term race when describing individuals and groups. Remember, we talked about the genetic reasons, we talked about the social difference reasons, we talked about ethnicity in the show of hands, maybe people aren't sure. There's a lot of reasons, so just try to think. Alrighty, okay, so just for sake of time, again, you know, one of my New Year's resolutions was to be less gabby and have more participation, and then I see I'm still talking till 10 after. So, gonna try to change that habit. So, does anyone want to share their results on why you think people may still tend to use the word race, even though, as a society, I think many people have kind of moved away from really seeing it as a valid description? Yep.
I think that for a lot of people, they don't use it to be like, they don't use it in a derogatory way. They just use it as like a describing word to distinguish different people. So they use race for any group of people regardless, and it's just used to describe it.
So the student in the front said there may not really be any intention or motivation behind it. It may just be kind of a term or a social fact. Remember from Durkheim, it's just how you talk about people. You use the term race. So it may not be very loaded. You know, if you tell people, oh, that's not really the best term, they might be open to changing it. Anything else? Any other reasons you think? Yeah.
It's not really like an answer, but I just thought of like that one recorded phone call 911 where the guy had called and the operator was asking, I don't know the person using the word race or like skin color, but like the person calling 911 wouldn't like specify that it was like, I think a black male. He was like dark white. So like, I don't know, I just thought of that.
Yeah, so that could be someone who, you know, they don't want to be part of a profiling issue or being, you know, imagining that they're, you know, if they're someone that doesn't really like to see people for their race very often or for their ethnicity, they may feel uncomfortable labeling someone that way. I mean, if someone's actively worked that way or they were taught that way to kind of not see people that way, it doesn't mean they can't recognize structural difference on an individual level, but they may be uncomfortable saying, oh, yeah, it was a white guy or black guy or whatever, and they were more focused on something else. Yep.
Maybe I just think that because many authorities, they will use the race instead of the minority groups because maybe a lot of they think that some people they are destiny they are born to be the race, be the people who have no power. I think when they use the term race, that maybe express that I'm priority than.
Yeah, so that's a great third point. So people using the term race, part of its kind of historical continuity or legacy, and this, you know, you can think of things we discussed before in fixed economies and fixed social systems. Remember we talked about those. So you could think of things like caste systems. So here the term race is more likely to be used if you're really strongly socially sorting people by rank. So you can think of like the Indian caste system, where if you're born in one caste, you know, you have X, Y, Z life opportunities versus someone in a higher caste. So that kind of stratified layer cake is much more kind of pronounced in a fixed society that way. Again, not that there's no room for innovation. I'm not trying to demonize any society. People can dissent and protest, but it's more difficult in those situations. Yep.
I think race is like easier to explain than ethnicity. I don't even think some people know what it, or they don't know how to answer that question. Where it's like, oh, like, what ethnicity are you? They're like, I don't know. It's easier to just say, oh, I'm brown or I'm like white. You know, like I think it's like more like of an umbrella term than ethnicity.
Yeah, and great point too. So oftentimes terms that are parsimonious, so meaning all the complexity can kind of just be said quickly. So like in math, a parsimonious equation is one with like the lowest number of terms. So people may opt for race over over ethnicity or minority for the same reason they may opt for sex over gender, which we discussed before, which is just because they think it's simpler to say the color of my skin or what I present as than, you know, how masculine or feminine I am, or what culture I identify with and all of this. So again, I think there are a lot of reasons, and this builds to my point that I made before, or reinforces it. There's a lot of reasons why people may do things or use terminology for things, but don't have kind of the intention behind it. You know, and as sociologists, that's a way we can kind of make an intervention in the world by saying, hey, you know, like these things you're doing, they're actually part of something that's problematic. And so I'm not targeting you as a person, but I'm just trying to help you see how this is connected to things that you may disagree with. Okay, so we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back. And I promise I'll try to be quick. You know, I always come in, especially on day one. I'm like, I only have half an hour to talk. Oh, I don't have anything to say, and then an hour and a half goes by. So, anyway. Alrighty. Okay. So. Again, I'm really happy about the attendance, and I hope it stays up all term. Okay, so now we have a few slides on. So we've talked about race and ethnicity, and the move to terms like racial minority and racialized population. Part of the importance for making these shifts away, again, is, you know, by moving away, and I was happy to see that, you know, I think people are divided in terms of what kind of category they see themselves as or use to describe themselves or other people. Again, I do think society is moving away from kind of rigid racial classifications. But part of why this is important is that the use of race as a category historically has led to, at the individual level and the group level, so I'll explain those, but both in people as individuals and people as groups, turning those categories of difference. So again, gender can be a category of difference, ability can be a category of difference, race, ethnicity can be a category of difference, something used to mark someone else as distinct and different and usually less than. So those categories often result in what's called prejudice. So prejudice and discrimination, which we'll see, are different terms. So we've talked a little bit about discrimination, but we have a whole bunch of slides on that. Prejudice is an individual term, whereas discrimination can be seen much more systematically. As I said, groups can be prejudiced too, so I'll explain that. So prejudice, so it has the prefix pre in it, and Judas with an ICE, not from Christianity, but prejudice is kind of prejudging people. So it's being prejudicial. So you're Judge Judy sitting there with your gavel, and you say, I've decided that this group is already not good. So, you know, and we all have prejudices, so some of them can be, you know, atrocious, like racist ones and ethnic ones, but others could be, you know, oh, I just don't like squash because the consistency is really bad and it triggers a memory of me when I was 7, and I ate this stuff that I didn't know it was, and I thought it was because I was getting punished for not liking the movie Pocahontas. So that, obviously not connected to me, but that's just a random example. So I was prejudiced. Children are very prejudiced against foods, they, you know, usually based on an association, but it could just be, you know, a profile, whatever, and then suddenly they like it. So I know I really didn't like pickled foods and all of these things. I wouldn't even try them. I just prejudged them. Said, no, they're all part of that category of food I don't want. You know, good parents really, they do all their little flight simulations and stuff to get their kids to eat foods and kind of get rid of that prejudice. So prejudice is holding these views before you actually meet or encounter the food. So it's just something you believe in your head. So that's why eliminating these categories or making them more nuanced and complicated is important. Because then we won't have stereotypes floating around about people, which then can translate into these sort of individual prejudices. So, as a concrete example, again using the tips and feedback from test 1, I gave some examples of prejudice around gender stereotypes. So remember, we kind of targeted Disney quite a bit, and their portrayals of men and women and princesses and stuff. The idea that, you know, men are supposed to be big and strong and saving women, and women are these damsels in distress, that can then lead children who watch those movies and play with dolls and all of that to internalize not some big discriminatory view necessarily. So there's a difference. A prejudice is a belief of difference or a belief about people without meeting them, whereas discrimination is kind of really, you know, being actively against them. So, you know, when I said I don't like pickled foods and squash, I'm not going out and telling people, you know, don't you dare eat pickles, they're awful. You know, no, I'm not doing that. I have my own little quirks. And I could do that. But being discriminatory would then be, you know, going to grocery stores and like smashing pickle jars and doing whatever. So like the Disney norms, part of why we're critical of those norms is that, you know, people may think, oh, as a little girl, I'm supposed to be this damsel in distress, or I'm supposed to be hyper thin, or I'm supposed to look a certain way. And they develop internalized prejudices. Some people will develop internalized discriminations if they say, oh yeah, I just want to be like the prince, he's so much better than the dumb princess or whatever. Again, oftentimes we're trying to get rid of these prejudicial decisions and say, actually, things are more complicated and people are more similar than you think. So linked to that, so that's kind of on a sociologist using race to get in people's minds and have them to think of things sociologically. Two sorts of fallacies are also related. I mentioned the ecological one to how these sorts of prejudices emerge. And then how different forms, how they may or may not become kind of concrete forms of discrimination, which we'll see in the next few slides. So the ecological fallacy is when you use statistics, presumably, I mean, they could be like fake news statistics and not good anyway, but presumably it's when you use information that has been vetted or approved about a larger population, and then every time you see a member of that population, you think, well, because that group is more likely to engage in X behavior, this person is probably going to engage in that behavior. So, for example, an ecological fallacy would be taking the statistical fact that women are more likely to enter teaching than men to say, well, every woman basically wants to be a teacher, women are better teachers than men hate teaching, all of that. So it's taking a kind of statistic and then applying it to each person. Now, it could sound kind of silly when you think of that example, because it would be maybe hard to find someone who says, you know, every woman wants to be a teacher, no man wants to be a teacher, based on a statistic. But where this gets quite awful and uncomfortable to say is more when you think of those examples I gave earlier of explicit racism. So think of early 20th century America, post-slavery. Black individuals are given rights in society. And many individuals, particularly in the South, many majority white individuals, may have strong prejudices based on things they heard. So things like black individuals being up to no good, or being lazy, or being criminogenic, remember, related to that crime information I told you in the 1700s and 1800s. And much more awful things. I don't want to repeat things that have been said in the past. But the ecological fallacy, again, is basing information about any one person on some presumed fact about a group. Now, inversely, and we may be more guilty of the second one than the first one. So the exception fallacy is when you actually observe something, or a friend of yours, a trusted advisor, we've all used that as data before, I'm sure, and what's called anecdotal evidence. The exception fallacy is when you've seen one person, or you've heard of one person doing something, and then you say, oh, well, the whole group does that because this one person does it. So this I can do more as my own example. So when I tell people my story about being a former wannabe pro gamer and all of that, I usually encounter someone who says, oh, you were a gamer? I thought gamers just blah, blah, blah. And then I'm like, okay, well, why do you think that they, live in a basement or look like a turtle or whatever the term? Not that I don't, but they have these things, so they say that. I used to have a really bad hunchback, actually, so I'm tall, but, bending over the arcade machines all the time. So the exception fallacy, though, is, I knew a gamer, and they really had no social skills, and they were so depressed. Or, versely, I knew a gamer, and they were so cool, I never thought they were a gamer, which kind of proves the same point. Or, I knew a gamer, and that's all they cared about, and then, that's what I think about gamers. And so if you think of kids, and again, going back to the social learning week and development, the way we learn about categories is usually through observations, right? So hopefully as adults we don't do this very often, but it is a tendency that people have. So you see one person of a category, and then you may think, oh, everyone's like that. You get bitten by a dog, and then you think, oh, dogs are all vicious. And then you realize, oh wait, actually it was like this little poodle that bit me, so I'm not going to be afraid of German Shepherds or whatever. And that would be a really weird kind of personal, subjective fear of dogs. Usually be the opposite. But so these fallacies, again, are important because you think if we have these categories, like race, gender, ethnicity, then people can develop prejudices either based on seeing someone in that category and then drawing an inference and saying, oh, everyone that looks this way or acts this way must have all of these negative attributes. Or positive ones. Or conversely, oh, I heard, quote unquote, those people tend to do those things. So again, part of the project of social scientists challenging different categories is to really try to help people see people as people and not as all of these markers of difference. And again, what makes this so challenging is by no means are we trying to erase people's struggles in the process. So that's why I made that point earlier. Race is real, gender is real as social constructions, which means they're influencing people's lives. But we're not saying we're all colorblind and racial blind. We're not doing that. So other terms just to know. So prejudice, again, this is more where the theories come in this week rather than drawing back to big theories like critical race theory and conflict theory and functionalism and stuff. So stereotypes and racism. So a person that is prejudiced, so they've prejudged, again, they've typically done that prejudicial work based on having learned and internalized stereotypes about a group. So again, for example, and I'll use gaming just because I don't personally like, talking about negative stereotypes that are very severe. Just makes me uncomfortable. But negative stereotypes, obviously, I mentioned about races, certain races being smarter or more having better work ethics than others. Those then lead people to make those sorts of prejudicial claims. Again, thinking about gaming, stereotypes of them as being loners. You'll see news articles about man-children and all these things. People addicted to their phones, no social skills. It's always the same kind of thing. Out of shape, all of this. Those stereotypes, again, if you're exposed to those enough, and then you see someone like that, you may think, oh, those stereotypes are right. And so, again, connected with racism, this is based on all of these stereotypes existing. It's kind of a more hierarchical claim that, well, this group that has all of these negative stereotypes attached to it must be inferior to this other group. So again, in the case of America, again, one that has a very clear kind of anti-black racist history, This is racism in America, particularly still ongoing today. You see with issues with the police, but much more pronounced and explicit in the early 20th century and 19th century. Racism is kind of an explicit doctrine where one race is superior to another, and all of the faults of that other group aren't just coincidental or random, but they're actually rooted in the alleged inferiority of that group. So slave owners across the world, not just in America, would often justify owning slaves by saying, well, those other people, what could they do without us? It's not like they would do anything anyway. They're so stupid or lazy, or they don't have the same mental capacities as us. So it's not like we're enslaving one of our own. We're enslaving someone who's kind of naturally a slave. So again, really awful things that people would do historically and still do. The same with, child marriage in certain places, and in Canada too. Again, I discussed with my other lecture, I think, last term, things like forced marriage and human trafficking, which still happens in Canada, so it's not just, a quote-unquote racialized thing. But all of these things, again, stereotypes are used around issues like sexism, racism, kind of all the isms you hear that are real problems, ableism, to justify the mistreatment of a group based on some idea of natural inferiority. Again, that's why we've moved so far away from the individual genetic kind of fixed explanations, because historically, that's how many of the world's atrocities have occurred, like slavery and Nazi Germany and pretty well colonialism, many things you could think of. Okay, so we've talked about prejudice, which again, you can think in a more lighthearted, weird way, or in, when you think of bigots and people with really, really pernicious, nasty views. Discrimination is something a little bit different. So we'll have some questions about this. But so discrimination tends to be more measurable. So, and have more real world impact. So this is not, again, to discount prejudice. Prejudice is wrong as well. We shouldn't be prejudiced about things. But, if I'm prejudiced against carrots and squash, that may not really amount to much. Whereas if I discriminate those things and I protest and whatever, that could hurt farmers or something. So again, it's, when you take an example like that, it's harder to explain. But so discrimination is when there is a measurable outcome to what you're doing. So here, in terms of humans and not vegetation, it is when an individual an individual member of a group is denied access to something. So typically when you think of discrimination, just a kind of quick definition of it is, again, the denial of access to a public good. So what does that mean? So historically, women and ethnic minorities, racial minorities, group minorities, whatever term we've decided on as sociologists, historically, an act of discrimination against women and ethnic minorities was barring them from formal education. With the case of women and minorities as well, not giving them the vote. That's discriminatory, because you're taking away a public good, meaning a right or a privilege, or even more physical. So black individuals in America being banned from many stores, from sitting on certain seats in the bus, having to use quote-unquote colored washrooms. Those are all acts of kind of formal, concrete discrimination. So to put this in perspective, someone could be extremely prejudiced. They could say, I only like people like me, I hate everyone else, but they may not actually discriminate against anyone. They could hold those views and never act on them. So that's very different. And discrimination, as you'll see too, you could be doing awful discriminatory things, or your country could, or your group could, or your workplace could, but they may not think that they may not actually know that they're doing it. They may not think that they're doing discriminating things based on prejudice. So, that's often, an example of that would be if, so an example of that, more indirect as we'll see, what's a good one? I have a whole bunch, but I think the example I like to use of kind of not seeing discrimination as direct would be the recent ban. Yes, I think this one's good because it's changed. The recent undoing of the ban on marijuana, or marijuana as being illegal. So for many years, people have used medical marijuana kind of medicinally, and it was the only thing that could help them remove their pain. Now these users were labeled as drug users. And because of that, they were doing something illegal, and this remedy that really worked for them was being seen as the same as people engaging in, quote-unquote party drugs, like LSD and Coke and all of this. So people that kind of found one therapy were now, they lobbied, as part of the law changing, they lobbied together and said, hey, we're actually a group of medical users that are being labeled and judged and discriminated against. We're not being allowed to use a drug that's good for us. So similarly, my research on death and dying. Canada, a few years ago, I don't know if you know, passed a law on physician-assisted suicide based on laws in Europe that had passed. And that was the same idea. This was saying, in other parts of the world, people in chronic pain are allowed to have their lives terminated when there's nothing they can do to make them not have that pain anymore. So we as a group are being discriminated against because, there's no remedy for us, but you're forcing us to kind of eke out this existence. There's a lot of debate on physician-assisted suicide, as you can imagine, based on pain thresholds and all of this. But the idea is, the group's voice cannot be heard. Their right to a relatively pain-free life was not being given to them. So there's lots of examples of that. So to clarify this, because I know this can be a bit murky, there are 3 types of discrimination. So you can see this, and we'll have questions on this, because this I think is the meatiest stuff of this week. So there's individual, direct institutional, and indirect institutional. So individual discrimination is the easiest. It's typically connected to prejudice, but it doesn't have to be. So this could be someone who, in the case of Nazi Germany, fits this. So an individual who follows orders. So let's say you are a soldier, and you're told to kill people in a certain house or a certain neighborhood of a certain appearance. So if they were told to kill Jewish individuals in certain parts of Germany, they would be following an order that was highly discriminatory, kill only this sort of person. And they would be doing it as an individual. They may or may not have a prejudice against that person. There were actually very many interesting trials. The recordings are available. Hannah Arendt wrote whole books on this, famous philosopher, on individuals who tried to justify their highly individually discriminatory actions. So people that literally pushed kill buttons to bomb whole areas that were rich with Jewish inhabitants. They'd kill thousands of them, and then under trial they would say, "Well, I was just following orders. What was I supposed to do? I was told not to think about what I was doing. I believe in my nation, and I'm just following orders." That, of course, didn't fly after many trials, but in the beginning it did. And people, they relied on, Hannah Arendt made this whole term, which inspired a lot of sociological work, called the banality of evil. And banal kind of means like everyday, humdrum, not interesting. And she said a lot of the atrocities that happen like this actually happen from people just saying, "Oh, I'm just doing what everyone's doing. Oh, I'm just, following orders." So individual discrimination, again, it could be someone saying, "I hate you, I'm going to target you," or it could be someone kind of checking out and just following groupthink. Now, direct institutional and indirect institutional, these are a bit murkier. So again, I think for individual, think of horrible things that have happened, think of things you've seen where you thought someone was being discriminatory, and think of their motive. Think, were they prejudiced? Are they following orders? Are they pretending to follow orders? Again, it's very hard to measure those things. Direct and indirect ones. So direct institutional discrimination, that's the example I gave before of women and ethnic minorities not being allowed to vote, not being allowed to have formal education. So it's formalized, part of the mandate of whatever institution you're in, that X group, X kind of person is not allowed, or they're only allowed on certain days, and so on and so forth. Now, indirect discrimination is much more interesting sociologically and really tied into our focus on social inequality. So, remember I asked you a question about higher education and how it's connected to the labor market and how individuals that are more wealthy are more able to devote more time to study and therefore get better grades. You know, there's so many issues with higher education around this question of indirect discrimination. So, for example, think of higher education and think of how few kind of Aboriginal students there are in university relative to the population. So they give the example later of Aboriginal individuals having high arrest rates, low graduation rates, and much of this is due to the kind of rampant racism against this population in society, you know, higher police profiling, negative treatment by teachers in schools. Remember, we talked about the history of the residential school system and all these stereotypes about Aboriginal students. So with indirect institutional discrimination, we could say, okay, as a university right now, we don't have any policies that say we're anti-Aboriginal, or we're anti-black, or we're anti-low SES people, or we're anti-women, or we're anti-disabled, or anything like that. But the university could be set up in a way that puts all of the majority groups opposed to those, so men and white individuals and able-bodied individuals and all of that, that puts them at a higher level. So the institution's kind of designed for them. So the idea that you have the money to come here, that you can physically come here, that you don't have learning disabilities, there are all these things that the university indirectly is discriminating against. So it's harder for someone with learning disabilities, harder for someone without money, harder for someone raising children. So all of those factors are what a sociologist would call, if they wanted to make a case against this, indirect forms of discrimination. And I think this is, to me, one of the most, you know, I told you, I didn't come into, because of my own experience as a high school dropout, I wanted to study adult education and educational policies. But I became really, really interested, I'd say in my third year of undergrad, in this sort of question of indirect. Remember, and we covered this. I'm wondering if anyone, what else did we study? What's the theoretical foundation? You'll get extra bonus points with me on a personal level if you remember this. It'll make me happy as a teacher. What theory or concept have we learned that talks about indirect consequences of things? Anyone? Yeah. Latent functions. Yes. Okay. So good. And I saw a bunch of hands. So show of hands if you knew that. Honesty points. A few of you, okay, good. So latent functions are exactly that. So remember, Merton said, the American dream, I mean, we didn't go all deep into this, but Merton has tons of articles on the American dream. And he said, well, the American dream's great for people that have the ability to live it out. So that's, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get rich, whatever. But the American dream puts a lot of pressure on individuals that are discriminated against to meet ideals that are not, you know, easy for them to attain. So for new immigrants, for women, for non-able-bodied persons, these ideals of being rich, being successful, looking a certain way, you know, being like a Disney prince or princess, whatever the category is, those create status frustration and role conflict and all this theoretical stuff, which is basically really just saying, it's exposing in America that there's a lot of indirect discrimination against a lot of groups, because a lot of the values we have, again, are based on a certain ideal of what's good, and there are pathways for those people to get those things, but those same pathways are much harder for other people. I'd like you to just spend, so let's see, the rest of this is mostly just statistics afterwards that we can go through pretty quickly. But I'm sorry, I'm always going so way over time. but spend 2 minutes, but keep it in your mind, and we'll get back to it next week, with your study buddy. What's an example of indirect institutional discrimination? And again, try to come up with creative examples with your study buddy and explain. So what is the example and why is it an example? Remember, so I'll keep up the definition there. So okay, so I'll revisit that at the end of the lecture for people that stay past the 2 hours. Again, I know a few students told me to stop apologizing for running the lectures quote-unquote late because we technically have 3 hours, but I try to keep it at 2. And then have that extra time for students that really want to stick around. Okay, so we've covered most of the meat and bones of race and ethnicity this week, racialization, all these terms. This stuff, again, don't be caught up. This isn't a course where I'm looking at, super specific details throughout history, because there's so much if you did it for every week. The general trend, this is all just information for you to get the general sketch of Canadian immigration. So this is something I know many of my friends, as I mentioned, part of what qualified me to teach this class, I guess, is that as a PhD student, you have to write 2 area exams where you read like 150 or 200 journal articles and answer 3 random questions, like do 3 big essays. And I did quantitative methods and sociological theory. So I know a lot about concepts, but not a ton about any given thing. So kind of a jack of all trades or whatever. But a lot of my friends have taken what's called the Race and Ethnicity Comprehensive Exam. And they always mention, I think that exam has the highest failure rate, and it's the hardest one. Not because the topic is, they're trying to trick people or anything, but race and ethnicity is also an exam about immigration. You can't study race and ethnicity without immigration. And that's, remember I said we're trying to shift to these terms of racial minorities and racialized populations because any of these categories only make sense when you're looking at a specific country's immigration and emigration history. So who came in and who left, who's defined as being top of the hierarchy, who at the bottom, and seeing how that changes both within countries and across countries over time. So, being quote-unquote brown or East Indian is very different depending on the country you're in, or being white. And in different time periods as well. So race and ethnicity always involve immigration. So on that note, looking at Canada and to see kind of how our racial categories bear the ideas that they do, 2 kind of statistics are interesting to think about here. So the 2 kind of biggest immigration bulges in Canadian history, the biggest occurred over 100 years ago. So between roughly 1890 and 1920. Again, this is just for context. Think, why was it so big? Well, this was shortly after Canada kind of formed as a settler colony. They tried out a few policies, weren't quite working. Then they had a much more open policy, although there were still problems with it, like Chinese head taxes and things we'll cover. But the policy opened up, and there were tons of Chinese immigrants coming in to work on the railways, and Italian immigrants, many of which worked in construction, building the kind of basic infrastructure of the country. So the biggest bulge was kind of a development of the industrial economy. Now, the second biggest bulge is happening right now. So we are deep in globalization, and many individuals from around the world see Canada, and particularly Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, as kind of hubs. So, you know, we have leading universities, we have all sorts of jobs in different industries. Obviously, they're difficult for individuals from other countries to attain. Oftentimes their credentials aren't seen as valued here. They have to take all sorts of tests. But needless to say, people do come from around the world at the highest rate now, only next to kind of Canada's, settler Canada's early formation. And if you look historically too, what's so interesting, when you see ebbs and flows in immigration rates, you should always look and say, oh, what policy was implemented there? Was there a war? Was there a national disaster in another country? What were the international relations like in that time? Immigration is so complicated and fascinating, but you know, it's unfortunate we can't spend that much time on it. So immigration, obviously, promotes population diversity. Again, the one issue with it is that people do tend to settle in urban areas. So the urban-rural divide is exacerbated usually. And when immigrants do move to more rural areas, it's usually due to economic reasons. So they may be coming in for a particular job. That job is often immigrant segregated. So many people enter field jobs. So Jamaicans in Canada historically have worked on farms and fields. Not all Jamaicans, obviously, but it's been more segregated. And certain Asian populations too. Thai individuals frequently work in wineries, all sorts of field work. There's a whole area of sociology on kind of manual labor and how that's racialized and nationalized. However, as I said, those 63% of immigrants, so the bulk, do live in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, and these would largely be considered economic immigrants. So I'm not going to get super into all the distinctions. Again, there's so much to cover. I'm more focused on race and ethnicity than immigration, just to keep things flowing out of sexuality and gender a little bit more closely. But a kind of key thing to remember here is people's motivations to come to Canada are linked also to you know, the spread of capitalism and colonialism around the world. So many people are fighting for jobs and resources that have become more scarce in their countries due to global processes that originated in Britain and the West a lot of the time. That's a big thing. We won't get to that fully till globalization, but our final week. But that's just kind of a connector to think about going forward. So just for sake of time, again, just think about this going forward. Why do you think people immigrate to Canada specifically? Again, there's economic motivations. Think of Syrian refugees and other refugees more recently. People being religiously discriminated against or ethnically discriminated against will come here. That doesn't mean they're not discriminated against here as well, but there are many motivations for coming here. Is it a land of opportunity? Is it something better relative somewhere else from a subjective perspective? Are people pushed out? All sorts of complex reasons. And then just lastly, minority groups in Canada. So I talked, again, these are just reference notes in case you have no idea, but I'll just be going over the most kind of common statistics about these groups. And not in any order of value or anything like that. So Aboriginal peoples, so if in America, as I've mentioned, the kind of most not in a competition sense, but the minority that's the most excluded against is typically Black Americans, African Americans. In Canada, it's Aboriginals. Aboriginal people here are only about 4% of the population. However, I said only because they're also the fastest growing segment of the population. And this, in part, is due to, there have been some successes in terms of Canada's relations with Native Aboriginal individuals. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but there are many initiatives going on in the contemporary time trying to level the playing field somewhat for this group. The population is extremely young, and they tend to die younger than other groups. And part of this is on reserves and kind of native Aboriginal segregated areas. There are housing shortages and food shortages. Again, as I mentioned, Aboriginals have by far the highest arrest rate, and there's police profiling of them, and all sorts of stereotypes floating around that are in the works of being abolished, I hope. Quebecois, so another defining factor, and again, some of these are themes that we've covered again, so that's why I thought I could barrel through them a bit faster. Canada, unlike America, America does have a huge Spanish-speaking population, but it's not a national language. You don't have to speak Spanish in most states to get a kind of state job. But in Canada, to get a government job, you usually have to be fluent in French. Canada has that split history of Anglo and Francophone individuals. So Quebecois, Bill 101 was a charter that said in Quebec, in many parts of Quebec, the national language or the sole language will actually be French rather than English. So again, that's something very unique relative to most other Western countries. However, Quebecois individuals are still a minority because the rest of Canada is majority Anglophone. And then South Asian Canadians and Chinese Canadians, not to lump them together, but these are two individual groups that were both similarly impacted by historical atrocities and received apologies by the government recently, 2006 and 2016. So Chinese Canadians, as I mentioned, were part of the population boom, was bringing in a ton of Chinese individuals to work on the CN Rail, the Canada National Railway, which was absolutely fundamental to the development of Canada. However, at that time, many white men that worked on the rails said, oh, these individuals are dirty, they're taking up all our jobs, and these sort of complaints served as a catalyst to develop what was called the Chinese head tax. So Chinese individuals had to pay higher fees to come into Canada than other immigrants. And that served as a catalyst for then a big historical apology and repayments where it was deemed possible. Similarly with South Asian communities and a group, the Komagata Maru, a ship was denied entry into Canada in 1914. This happened after many, many South Asians were rejected from the country, but this was the most explicit, that you had about 400 people that was a really long journey, people, sick on the journey, dying on the journey to get here, and then being turned away right when they're here. It was seen as, news and everything obviously wasn't the same in 1914. But that became a reference point for both white and non-white Canadians throughout the 20th century to say, we really need to get rid of these discriminatory policies. The idea that you would allow a kind of ship to leave knowingly and then block it off once it gets here is cruel and unusual punishment to do to any group. So even people of prejudice kind of viewed that as an atrocity. So both of these groups, again, current racial minorities, not getting too much into immigration, but you can see, there are certain parts of the city, when you think of things like Little Italy, Chinatown, different names people have for different parts of cities. This is because at certain times, bulges of these individuals or members of these groups would move into the city, and they would kind of be pushed into these areas or selecting them based on where members of that group already lived. Again, everyone's immigration decisions are individual. And obviously there are more minorities than these. These are just the ones I think the textbook talks the most about. So black Canadians are the third largest minority group in Canada, and of course the history of slavery in North America, more strongly in America, but also here, greatly impacts the majority population's interactions with them. They're as likely to attend university as any other group, but are more likely to earn less and be unemployed more often afterwards. So again, this is a key finding for saying, oh, a group that's as likely to be as educated as other individuals achieves lower outcomes. Why is that? It could be individuals out in the country having prejudiced views, and a combination. It could be there being a series of discriminatory policies against these individuals, things like carding that have, has been changed recently, but all these sorts of stereotypes floating around, and that result in stratification. And then lastly, so all of this, so Canada is a country that's now, or has been, founded on things like the Mosaic, seeing individuals as all equal. So what was put in legislation and what we're striving towards, but again is far from perfect, can be captured by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this is kind of what's always turned to when you're thinking of something as an act of discrimination or institutional or indirect or direct. You say, okay, is a set of practices that's going on, or do a set of practices that are occurring, do they align with the core tenets of our Charter of Basic Rights? So this is freedom of expression. So again, this has been opened up over time. So things like gay marriage have fallen under freedom of expression, that you can express love for a consenting adult, and that doesn't have to be heterosexual. The right to a democratic government, well, that's kind of been in place for a while. But this comes into question of saying, oh, certain groups are more or less likely to vote. Why is that happening? Are certain groups, is it harder for them to vote? Are they more likely to be underpaid and underemployed, and therefore not see themselves as connected to society as other people? Is this a systemic issue? All these sorts of indirect things. And then the freedom to live and seek employment anywhere in Canada. So that's speaking directly to racial segregation and explicit discrimination. So individuals feeling unsafe in other neighborhoods. So America, with all the atrocious lynchings and anti-black events that were happening in the 20th century, clearly that's an example where that criterion wasn't being met. So lastly, so just a picture of that. So the Charter of Minority Rights, again, all of these things are supposed to be working together. So again, Canada is based on a multicultural heritage, starting with English and French, and then seeing, the value that immigrants, such as Chinese and Italian immigrants, played in building our infrastructure, building everyone's infrastructure, and then seeing immigration as key to kind of maintaining Canadian population levels, seeing Aboriginals as part of this story, all of us on equal footing, but realizing that there are still systemic inequalities. Legal rights for people accused of crimes, that everyone is under the same law. Again, race is real and categories are real and they impact us, but under the law we're all the same, or we're supposed to be the same. The right to equality, including equality of men and women, the right of French and English linguistic minorities to an education of their own language. So if you're in Quebec, which is French dominant, you should still be able to allow to speak only English if you want, and vice versa in the rest of the country. And then lastly, the rights of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. And so all of these tie into one another, and they're all part of the cycle as they're all still being developed. Again, as a Western democracy that prides itself on individual values and rights and freedom, we're not perfectly there. So the last thing, just true or false. Again, I'll be more on point next week. I'm recalibrating my timing. True or false? So just a senior citizen who witnesses a teenager vandalizing property and proclaims, "Kids today are all the same. They have no respect," is an example of the ecological fallacy. False or true? So who says true? Who says false? Oh, everyone. Okay, so someone tell me, why is it false? Yeah. So why is it an exception? Exactly. Perfect. So bonus, so see that, so that one again, so they see a team, so this again, so these things are interesting on any given person. It could be one or the other. I won't be grilling you on both, but this is, I'm really happy because I thought you were going to say ecological, I thought you were going to say true. So I'm really happy that you saw that it's false. This is more an exception. So people, typically they'll see something and then they'll generalize outwards, and then when this old person or whatever, senior, sees someone again, they may be leery of kids and think, oh, that person's going to be a vandal. So this is how a lot of racist and xenophobic things happen too. If someone hears the story of like, oh, someone was mugged by this person in this neighborhood, in Toronto, Jane and Finch, which again was not very far from where I grew up, that was always seen as this. But people in my neighborhood in North York, again, there was just a little southwest of there. I was by Don Mills and Finch. I was on the same street. And people would say, oh, avoid that neighborhood, you're going to get killed, and by certain people, and same things about certain neighborhoods in Toronto as well. People would often, again, either anecdotally, maybe fiction, through gossip and rumors, have these exception fallacies and say, well, it happened to my friend, so don't you ever go there or come back in a body bag. Okay, so again, writing center, 2 to 4, if I don't see you again. I will make an announcement about the room, and Jason, again, the lead TA, should be there. So, yes. So remember, complete assignment 2. You have your tutorials this week, so you can also, and office hours this week as well. So make sure you saw that announcement by Mr. Jason. You have lots of support for assignment 2 this week. You have all those office hours there, so you can find your TA. So Jason will be there for like 4 hours on Friday. I strongly suggest you talk to them, attend tutorials, come with questions, and then I'll see you next week.